Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whenever you're watching this. Welcome to April's reading wrap up. I don't usually do these reviews sat on the floor, but today that is just what felt comfortable. In the month of April, I read 7 books, so on average, about good going for me. I usually read somewhere between 6 to 8. Anyone that's new here, my name's Charlotte. Welcome to my channel. I do monthly book reviews and reading wrap ups. I have no book target set this year, and I have ditched the star rating system just because neither of those things are working for me. For the year so far, I'm on 29 books, so I'm actually doing better than I was this time last year with a reading target. Let's see how many this month were physical versus digital. 3 physical, 2 audiobooks, 2 Kindle books. I'll put my story graph in the description box so you can keep up to date with what I'm reading there. I do tend to give things star ratings on there just for the system and for the data and everything. But yeah, I'm just gonna talk through with you today what I read, what my thoughts were. It's a little bit of a wild ride, and we're gonna start with the most intense part of the wild ride. So I started my month off with something that I've been putting off for a very long time. I started the tandem read for Empire of Storms and Tower of Dawn by Sarah J Maas. I read the physical version of Tower of Dawn and I read the digital version of Empire of Storms on my Kindle. For those of you that haven't read the series or don't know the concept of the tandem read, is that I read both of those books at the same time because the events of the books take place at the same time. There's lots of guides online. I will link the one that I used below, and it basically tells you where you need to change chapters. So I pre-tabbed this book. You can see I've taken a lot of them out. It will tell you to read like up to chapter 6 of Tower of Dawn, then you can read chapter 7 through to 9 of Empire of Storms, and you keep chopping and changing. You don't have to read it like that, but it kind of is supposed to give you the most emotional impact. And I'm going to start with a little synopsis of each book. I'm going to review them together because that's how I read them, and I'm going to talk about my experience with the tandem read. This portion of today will not be spoiler free, I'm afraid, because there's no way for me to really review these properly without giving spoilers. So if you haven't read these books or gotten up to the series yet, skip forward. This is the only review today that I think will contain spoilers. Empire of Storms is book 5 and Tower of Dawn is book 6. So in Empire of Storms, a brief synopsis is that Aelin is on a journey to reclaim her throne, and she's got her small but loyal court with her. This is basically a big journey of how she travels around gaining allies and the support of other houses, other families, other courts, other monarchies, etc. So in Tower of Dawn, which is book 6, this is following Chaol and Nesryn. They travel to the south to find a healer because, in case you've forgotten, Chaol is paralysed from the waist down. Irene Towers is tasked by the healer on high to repair Chaol. Unfortunately, she has categorically no desire to heal a lord from Ardalan. Ardalan? Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing any of this. Mainly because she has some awful memories of the Ardalanian Empire from her childhood. This is the portion which will not be spoiler free. Please skip forward now if you want to avoid spoilers. This is your last chance. So the tandem read took me just over 2 weeks. I'm going to review like my experience with the tandem read first of all. It took me 16 days to read both. They're both quite chunky books. This one has like 700, 800 pages, 650, and I think Empire of Storms is about the same. It was mainly the swapping back and forth. I am quite glad I did one physical and one Kindle, because although I couldn't tab, I could have tabbed the Kindle, but I'm not going to go through and bookmark because I was worried about seeing spoilers. I tabbed this one and just had the guide up while I was reading, and that's kind of what took the longest, is switching between them. My main worry was that I'd struggle to differentiate the books, especially when it got to this kind of like reviewing portion that I'm doing, but actually the books are about 2 completely different sets of characters and feel very distinctly different in setting, in voice, in events of the book. So actually I was really pleasantly surprised that I feel really able to differentiate which was which. I'm not muddling the events of each book. I am overall really glad that I did the tandem read, and personally I would really recommend it. I felt like it had a lot more emotional impact for me, and I felt like it really enhanced the story. I was talking to one of my friends who didn't do the tandem read, and she said that because book 5 is following Aelin, once she'd read book 5, she rushed through book 6 and didn't really like Chaol's story because it felt a bit boring because she was in such a rush to get back to Aelin's story. And generally online, from what I've read, people don't like Chaol's book. I felt like reading them alongside each other was really beneficial because of that. I think if I'd have read them separately, I would have felt the same. Like I would have been worrying about getting back to the book to get to Aylin's story. I don't know if it would have been clear to me that the events of the book take place at the same time, like each book. As for the books individually, if we're looking at book 5, I feel like the pace definitely picks up. We see a lot more action in book 5, and the Assassin's Blade started making a little bit more sense to me. I read the Assassin's Blade as the 3rd book and I found it really, really boring. Well, not really, really boring, but I was just a bit like, like, I get its context now, and everything starts to kind of knit together and feel like it's all coming together. I will say, probably symptomatic of the tandem read, but there is a lot of coupling up in book 5 and a lot of romantic elements. I think it's generally quite well known that Throne of Glass is obviously less spicy than ACOTAR, which I don't care about, that's fine for me. I do see it coming for the characters because everyone kind of starts coupling up, which is to be expected with her writing, to be honest. But I think because I did the tandem read, it felt like I got to a certain point in the books and every single chapter, bam, 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 new couple, new couple, new couple, new love interest. And I got a bit like fatigued by it. I usually enjoy an SJM coupling, but it just felt like maybe a bit too much. I never thought I'd say that, but I was just kind of like, okay, and another couple, and another couple, and another couple. I don't think it was really that much of a bad thing. It just was really noticeable that every other chapter someone partnered up. I love Lysandra with all my heart and her character development, and I love, love, love Dorian and Manon, and I love Dorian. I really like where they've gone with Dorian's character. He is probably my favourite SJM man. I feel like Dorian and Rhysand are same make, different model, but if I'm honest, don't arrest me for this because I know you'll all have something to say, but I prefer Dorian over Rhysand. One thing I did have that was a bit of a criticism, and again, maybe it was because I was tandem reading and there was a lot of information, but the concept of the settlement has only just been raised and it felt very shoehorned in. I'm a bit surprised it took 5 books to mention the settlement. It kind of felt like, oh fuck, we just remembered Adrian and Aylin are half fae, like what's gonna happen, do they die? Let's just make up this concept called the settlement. I don't know, I just feel like we had 5 books, 3 that have been mentioning fae quite strongly, and all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, you'll see when she settles, and she's like, what? I forgot about the settlement. It just felt a bit clumsy. Also, the end of the book had me gagged. I gasped. SJM always does that for me. I don't think she's necessarily like a great writer, but she's like very good at being a commercial writer, and her plots always get me. So to review Tower of Dawn, this is definitely Chaol's redemption book. I mentioned in the last, I think it might have been November's video, that was the last time I read a Throne of Glass novel, that I was really not liking the direction Chaol was going in, and to be honest, I don't like him as a character that much. Even when he was like the good guy, he still is the good guy, but you know what I mean. I was pleasantly surprised by him in this book. I don't know what's going to happen in Kingdom of Ash. At the time of recording this, I'm about 60% of the way through reading it, so it will be in next month's review. I'm like really convinced she's going to kill Chaol off. There's nothing to indicate that so far. I just think she's going to kill him. He just seems to me like a character that dies, but I don't think the people would like that, so maybe she won't. I know this book gets a lot of stick, but I think that's just because of the characters, but I really enjoyed the setting of this book. One thing I'm really drawn to in fantasy generally is like the concept of the southern continent. I love deserts, I love dry, arid landscapes, I love the vibrancy of the descriptions of where it is, so like the food, the culture, the clothes. Generally the southern continent concept is like fairly liberal. It's not as like straight-laced as kind of like the medievally English-esque cities like Rifthold in this instance. I would actually really like to read more fantasy that's kind of got this southern continent aspect that's set there, so if you have any recommendations, let me know. I don't want to read Dune, but I will if enough of you recommend it. I feel like I probably should read Dune because I love Dawn in Game of Thrones, I love Antica, I can't remember the name of it, but I love the desert in the Assassin's Blade. Like I like stuff that's set in like desert settings. I think it's just a bit more interesting to me because so much of fantasy is set in kind of like medieval-esque stone-walled cities, and it gets a bit boring. I found Tower of Dawn a little bit off to a slow start, I'm not gonna lie. Like the beginning, Chaol's a bit insufferable, Nesrin's a bit insufferable, through no fault of her own. I think that's Chaol's fault. But I will say this book, they really do good things with the tension. There were some scenes where genuinely, like the chase scenes in the castle, my heart was beating. I was like, this is quite scary. Like it was quite frightening, and there was a couple of scenes of that. The concept of like being chased and being followed it was so tense, and we haven't had that in writing since whenever Aelin was last being followed in the castle, so, or like, you know, being watched. So that was a really nice change of pace, to be honest. So overall, I think these two books in combination have been my two favourite books of the series so far, despite the intense coupling and romance and partnership. It's very easy of me to say that these have been my favourite two books so far when the last time I read anything from this series was November, so I think objectively they are for now, but maybe it's just because it's fresh in my mind. I feel like that wasn't a very substantial review, but I feel like so much happened events-wise in both of these books that I'm struggling to review it by the events that took place. I'm just kind of reviewing it on how it made me feel and the vibe. My next read was a Kindle Unlimited. After the tandem read, I felt a bit like shell-shocked. I didn't really know what to do, and I didn't want to start straight away on Kingdom of Ash, so I needed something a little bit unserious. So I read Wild Love by Elsie Silver. This is part of a new series. They're called the Rose Hill series, and this is book 1 of Rose Hill, and this is a romance. To summarise, Ford Grant has been dubbed by Forbes as like the world's hottest billionaire. All he wants to do is stay out of the limelight and build a little recording studio on a ranch in his hometown of Rose Hill. His plan to do so is interrupted by a young girl called Cora turning up on his doorstep claiming that she's his biological daughter. The other character, Rosie, is used to living in the city but has to move back to Rose Hill when she gets fired from her job. She ends up begging Ford for a new job and works under him. She is also his best friend's little sister, and he vows to keep her at arm's length. Main tropes are like single dad, my brother's best friend kind of thing, billionaire trope, I guess. Very, very, very loosely rivals to lovers, maybe, which I'll talk to you about in a second. I feel like that's a very generous rivals to lovers. I previously loved the Chestnut Spring series by Elsie Silver, so I was really pleasantly surprised when I saw that she had a new series released. I didn't actually know. I feel like it's just completely gone over my head because I've not been reading a huge amount of romance lately. My understanding of this series is that it's all some kind of single dad romance trope in some capacity, and I feel pretty neutral about that trope, to be honest. It's not like something I seek out, but it's not something that makes me feel a bit ick. I don't usually seek out romance books with other like family dynamics in them, so like single dad or like single parent in general. But that being said, I do always think having a relationship dynamic that's explored, that's beyond the like romantic relationship dynamic, so adding an extra element of like sibling or familial or platonic, always adds an extra layer to romance, which I quite like. It just has a bit of depth to the characters, and Elsie Silver's quite good at doing that because obviously all of hers are kind of like partaking in the same quote-unquote universe, and it adds a bit of a reprieve from the smut. And I know the smut is why we read a lot of these books, but sometimes like it's hard to differentiate. If you're in a place where you're reading a lot of romance and a lot of smut, they all blur into one. In my opinion, it makes them more memorable if they have like extra elements to them beyond the romantic interest and the sex. Actual thoughts on the book, now that I'm done yammering about familial relationships. I think it was good, but I thought it could be better. I expected maybe a little bit more following how much I enjoyed the Chestnut Spring series. I don't want to call it unmemorable, but it was just very like okay. I think maybe the actual book was a little bit too long, which is weird to say, and I just didn't feel that invested in the characters. I think maybe it didn't wow me because it had this like rivals trope, and I say very loosely rivals because it was the kind of rivals where the guy is really down bad for the girl, but the girl is just convinced for literally no reason that he fucking hates her and that they hate each other, and actually he's like never hated her. He's just like strong silent type who has a crush on her and has done since they were like teenagers, and that kind of annoys me because it feels like easily pulled apart. It's just a female protagonist that's convinced that he hates her, like with very little basis to think that. Cora, who's Ford's daughter, felt like a nice addition to this book, but I will say her age feels a bit all over the place. So she's 12 in the book, but often she's discussed and her interactions make her feel more like she's a teenager, so about 16, 15. And then we get these odd pockets where you kind of remember her age, and she has like, as she should, a childish moment or like a juvenile moment because she's dealing with her own set of circumstances in the book, which would be hard for any 12-year-old. And I just feel like her age isn't written that accurately or that well. Overall, this was a really light and easy read. I wanted something unserious, and that was what I got. Very much okay, dare I say, a little unmemorable. I probably won't read the rest of the series. I think my tolerance or my standards for romance books has been raised. I've noticed I'm reading a lot less and I'm a bit more critical of them. So I tend to not read a lot of the like Kindle Unlimited romances anymore. I just don't think they're up to par with what I'm expecting a lot of the time nowadays. But that's not to say the book wasn't good. Some people really love it because Elsie Silver is really popular and I loved her last series, but I will stop rambling about that now. My next book was an audiobook and it was Heroes by Stephen Fry. This is a historical fiction and it's Stephen Fry's Greek Myths book 2, although I will say you don't have to read Mythos first, you can read them separately, they're standalone. So in the second book of this series, Stephen Fry is retelling Greek myths that are primarily based around like legendary heroes in Greek mythology. Straight off the bat I found this a lot harder to digest than Mythos. So this is probably something to do with it. The stories in the book are generally longer and more complex. Mythos to me felt nice and like segmented out, and some of them were really short, but just I think because of the nature of these myths they become a bit more sprawling. I found that more difficult to engage with, but I think that generally speaks more to my listening comprehension than it does to the quality of the book, because this book has got really good reviews. I think it just lost me in some sections. Dare I say it, I think I would have found this easier to read than to listen to, which really surprises me because I find Greek stuff sometimes a bit of a struggle to read. I was quite engaged from the start. I found myself flagging a little bit in the middle, and that was mainly to do with the complexity of the story of the Golden Fleece, which actually at the start of that chapter Stephen Fry does preface it with how sprawling the story is and how difficult it can be because of how many characters there are. That was where it kind of lost me and I found it a little bit hard to dip in and out of. The book did redeem itself by the end. I think I would recommend this book regardless, and I would definitely recommend Mythos, and definitely would say listen to Heroes if you liked Mythos, because I think the things that I didn't enjoy about this book weren't because it was badly written, it was because of me struggling to understand it. Overall, I do think Stephen Fry's narration, anecdotes and explanations are just generally really accessible, and he makes it really entertaining and really funny to listen to. I found Mythos an absolute delight. I know this isn't a Mythos review, but I think it carries over into this book. It is difficult to make Greek mythology concise, but I think he does a really good job. Overall, I enjoyed this one less. It felt like a bit more of a slog to me. But like I said earlier, I think that is, in this instance, a reflection of me instead of the quality of the book. Okay, my next book was a physical book. It was from the library. I'm in my library era. I would recommend it all to you. And it was A Man Called Ove by Frederick Bateman. This is a fiction book and it's quite short, and I will give you a synopsis now. So Ove is an old man, but the kind of old man that has very staunch principles, strict routines, and just generally seems like a grumpy old guy. He is the kind of neighbour that his neighbours refer to him as like the neighbour from hell. This novel overall, without giving too much away, is the kind of novel that likes to remind you that everyone has a backstory, and it asks you to consider the impact that one person might have on a much larger group of people without knowing. This is the second review today that I'm starting by referencing another novel that the author has written, but it's contextual, I promise. So I read Beartown. I really enjoyed it for the most part, and when I posted it on my story, a lot of people responded like, oh, have you seen or read A Man Called Ove, because this is a movie as well. And so many of you recommended this to me. So many people had said they were like touched, moved by it, and I was in the library not looking for anything in particular, and this was like front facing, so I just thought I'd grab it because I thought it's quite short. I haven't wanted to continue the Beartown series just yet because all of the books are quite long, and I'd like to say sorry to all of you, I didn't really like this book. I do get what it was trying to do, and I understand that I need to like reserve my judgment for Ove, etc. I'm not gonna lie, I did find it quite sad and like quite moving at points. Like I was just kind of constantly weeping throughout this book, and I say weeping instead of crying because like tears, my eyes were just leaking, you know, and it's just like constantly streaming, especially in the last quarter of the book. I just didn't enjoy the read, and it's not because it made me cry. So I found it quite hard to get into, and the only reason I persevered is because when I read Beartown, I found that the first 100 pages were quite like a slow slog. So I thought, okay, maybe this is just the author's style, although I will admit like 100 pages is like a third of this book, so that's why I didn't DNF it, because I'd read their works before, and because of the recommendations I thought, oh, maybe I'll have a change of heart. Was ultimately proved wrong in my preconceptions of Ove, but like I just didn't care. Like, I wasn't emotionally invested in Ove. I didn't really like the ending that much. I wasn't very moved. Obviously I get that like his story is meant to be moving, but like I just wasn't moved. Maybe that's really cold-hearted of me, but yeah. I think I'm just really over reading like sad and moving books, or like books that feel a little bit traumatic. The last two books I've read that have made me cry, I haven't enjoyed. And I know that sounds really obvious because like I don't enjoy crying, but I've not really enjoyed like reading them or that process. And don't get me wrong, so I like devastating books that like leave me with a hole in my chest, but I don't like sad books. Yeah, that does sound really obvious, but I'm not at the moment into consuming any kind of media that makes me like unnecessarily sad. If it's poignant, if it's moving, if it like consumes me and I feel devastated, that to me is very different to like a book that is just sad for sad's sake. And that isn't really sad for sad's sake because there's a point to it. It's supposed to like make you think, oh, that everyone has an impact on someone somewhere, XYZ, remove your judgment, but it just didn't do much for me. It says warm, funny and unbearably moving, and I don't think it's that warm. I do think there's some moments that are like funny, but I don't think it's unbearably moving. Let me know what you thought of this, because I feel like my opinion is going to be the unpopular opinion here, because out of all of the people that messaged me recommending, I only had one person that messaged me was like, let me know how you think of this, because I found it really hard to get into. I think they DNF'd it, and I was like, yeah, you know what, like I'm not loving it. So I think we're kind of the exception, not the rule, in terms of this book. Okay, next up was an audiobook that I listened to on Spotify, and it was Down the Drain by Julia Fox. This is autobiographical. I don't really have a synopsis for this other than that it is Julia Fox's autobiography. A little bit of a diversion, but I'm assuming that an autobiography is like the retelling of someone's life, or the telling of someone's life up to a point. Whereas to me, a memoir seems distinct from an autobiography, and that a memoir is a little bit more like literary. Is that right? Because I don't know if I would call this a memoir, but I use the term memoir and autobiography very interchangeably, and I'm assuming a memoir has a bit more of a literary quality to it. So yeah, just curious about that. So quite a lot of my mutuals on Storygraph have read this, and all of them have reviewed it as 5 stars. And I'm not inclined to disagree with that. I don't care to use a star system very much anymore, and I've mentioned this before, I don't like to use a star system on autobiographies or memoirs, because who am I to say that someone's like retelling of their life is 1 star or 5 stars. Also, I think a lot of the types of autobiographies I listen to, I don't expect like a huge great literary masterpiece. It is just like celeb autobiographies. I didn't really know much about Julia Fox other than Uncut Gems, which I haven't seen, her black eyeliner, Kanye West, and kind of all her like viral sound bites of her and her vocal fry. I was really pleasantly surprised. I really like listening to memoirs, autobiographies that are narrated by the author, because I feel like we get them read to us and delivered in the way that the author intended. I also really like her voice. It's quite dry, it's quite funny, it's quite soothing to listen to. She's lived such a life of like terrible loss and like trials and tribulations, and also intense stardom. And yeah, I just went in like really not knowing what to expect. It becomes very dark at points, but I feel like her authenticity and her purpose and her voice remains very, very clear throughout. Worth the hype. I would recommend listening to the audiobook if you can. Big content warnings on this, because she has a very graphic and uncomfortable way that's a bit shocking at points, I think, of describing sexual acts that like made my stomach turn a bit. It wasn't that they were like necessarily terrible acts, it's just like, I think it's the context and the way she just like describes it, and because you know it's a true story. So just check the trigger warnings. It's not just about the sexual content, but there's a lot of stuff, so just proceed with caution on that one. The next book I read was a physical book, and it was Big Swiss by Jen Beagin, and this is a fiction book, and I really enjoyed it. So one of our main characters, Greta, lives in Hudson, I believe, and she is a audio transcriber for a sexual therapist. So she listens to lots of tapes of conversations between him and his clients. She becomes obsessed with one of his clients called Big Swiss. That's not their name. She nicknames them Big Swiss. She's big, tall, blonde from Switzerland. She doesn't realise, but she's going to meet Big Swiss at a dog park, and everything just gets a bit out of hand, and that's really all I can say about a synopsis. I had no idea what this book was about, only that it was really popular and loads of people had recommended it to me. Loads of my mutuals had read it on Storygraph, and I really like the cover. I think it's really nice to look at. It's so weird. It's a bit odd. It's beehives, lesbians, dogs, stalkers, affairs. Generally it's quite grotesque. Mini donkeys, weirdly disengaged sex that feels very clinical, and obsessive romance are just some of the things that are mentioned. It's funny, it's weird, it's a bit twisted, and it's quite dark at points, and overall I really enjoyed it. It's got this very like repellent and repulsive quality to it that I quite enjoy in books. I had a few moments where it like made me feel a bit like, ooh, like queasy, you know, it just like turns your stomach. It's just, I guess the correct word to use would maybe be like, it's a bit visceral at points. The bulk of it feels very character driven. It has this like messy female protagonist element that's really, really popular at the moment. You know, the kind of like insufferable female lead that you're never really quite sure if you like or you don't like. You try root for her and she just makes things inherently worse. But I think that's very entertaining, and Greta's inner monologue is like really entertaining throughout. I didn't really end up knowing kind of what happened in the book, and this is the kind of book that I feel very glad that I ditched my star rating system, because while I really enjoyed it, I would really recommend you read it, I don't know if I'd ever pick it up again. Like, it's not the kind of book I would revisit, like I really want to read that again. Maybe I will, but you know, some books you just know what you're going to pick up again. Very bizarre, very atmospheric. And I did have a peek at some of the reviews after I wrote my review, because I think this is quite the case with messy female protagonists, is that you often get really mixed reviews. People love or they hate insufferable women, but generally this is really up my street, and I didn't realise until I read the inside cover that they're looking to make this into a TV adaptation with Jodie Comer, which I think will be amazing. So my final thoughts are that this was pretty absurd, but not quite as insane as I thought it would be. So that was all the books that I read for this month, but I do have one that I DNF'd, which is Did Not Finish, so I'll go through that with you quickly. It was Wednesday's Child by Yi Lee. This is another one I got from the library. I picked this up because ages ago I saw in Waterstones that Book of Goose just had a beautiful cover, and it was hardback, and I'm not buying books this year, but it really caught my eye and I thought about reading it. And then I saw this beautiful cover and realised it was by the same author, and I saw this in the library and I just grabbed it. This is short stories and this is fiction. I DNF'd it maybe 3 short stories in. I usually really love short stories, and I quite like to discuss like why I DNF books, because it's not something that happens very often. I'm trying to get better at it. Contemporary fiction, I really thought I'd enjoy it, but from my understanding, a lot of the stories are about motherhood and like familial relationships and are quite poignant, and it's not that I didn't enjoy them. It was a bit too much for me. She's an amazing storyteller, and I think her characters are written so well. But I did a little bit of research in the author onto why I was feeling so like hollow when I was reading this, because it's like, it's too poignant, like it's like a bit too lonely, and there's some kind of like elements of suicide and grief and loss in a lot of these stories. It left me feeling a bit like a shell of a person. Not to reduce the author to this, but she had 2 sons that both committed suicide via the same method, and I think there's a lot to do about grief in this, and how there was like elements of that in this story, in these short stories. I think I was wondering why this was making me like uncomfortable in terms of like the humanness and the compassion of the characters and some of the subject matter, and it was like quite confronting, and I just was like not in a position to read this. It's that kind of like ordinary existence in a short story, but for some reason it's like quite haunting. So yeah, that was why I DNF'd that, and it's a shame. I just knew I wasn't really in like a position to read it. It wasn't overly tragic to say. I think that is more of a reflection of my headspace than Yi Lee's writing. But yeah, you might like this, Wednesday's Child. I love short stories, so I might revisit it in the future when I'm feeling more optimistic. Those are my April reviews. I hope you enjoyed. I will be interested to hear what all of you think if you've read any of those books. Feel free to add me on Storygraph, because I love seeing what everyone else is reading. I get quite a lot of inspiration from the community tab, and I like it that when I type in a book, add it to my TBR, I often like see my mutuals or friends that want to read it have read it, etc., and it informs quite a lot of my book opinions. Thank you for watching. It would mean loads to me if you left a little thumbs up or a comment or subscribed if you enjoyed my content. I upload on Wednesdays and Sundays. All my socials will be in the description box, and I will see you on the next video. Have a lovely rest of your day. Bye.